The man sat alone at the gate, his uniform jacket folded neatly across his lap. The blue ribbon of a Medal of Honor gleamed softly against the worn fabric, a silent testament to a lifetime of service. But no one noticed. No one saw. What no one in that crowded terminal realized was that in just a few moments, a 4-star general would step off the arriving flight, and everything would change. If you believe that respect isn't a courtesy, it's a promise we owe to those who earned it, stay with us. Like, subscribe to Endless Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because this story will remind you what it means to see the man behind the ribbon. The airport was a blur of movement, a swirl of voices and footsteps echoing against the glass and steel. People hurried from gate to gate, their heads down, their eyes fixed on the bright screens above. Businessmen in pressed suits tapped at their phones. Families wrangled children and luggage, the quiet hum of 100 conversations blending into the low roar of jets overhead. In the middle of it all, a man sat alone in a row of plastic chairs by gate 47. His posture was straight despite the years that had bent his shoulders, his hands resting in his lap. His hair was white and close-cropped, the lines of his face deep and steady. He wore a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a pair of well-worn khakis. Folded across his lap was a jacket, dark blue and heavy with the weight of years. Pinned to that jacket, a small, sky-blue ribbon caught the light each time someone brushed past. A Medal of Honor, its simple star shining against the worn cloth. But no one noticed, or if they did, they looked away quickly, as if the sight of it was too much to bear in the rush of their own small lives. The man watched the gate in silence, his eyes calm and patient. He had been waiting a long time. Waiting had never bothered him. In the field, waiting had been survival. The quiet before the firefight, the hush of breath in the dark jungle. Here it was the same. Just another moment to hold himself steady, to remember the men he had carried with him in the quiet of his heart. The terminal bustled around him, the announcements crackling overhead in cheerful voices. No one stopped to look twice at the old man with the folded jacket and the bright ribbon. No one asked his name. To them, he was just another tired traveler, another body in a seat waiting for a plane to take him somewhere else. A young woman in a red blazer bustled by, her eyes on the clipboard in her hands. She paused for a moment as she passed, her gaze flicking to the small star on the man's lap. Her brow creased, as if she almost recognized it, but she said nothing. She moved on quickly, her heels tapping a brisk rhythm on the polished floor. The man didn't mind. He had never been one for words. The medal on his lap was not a thing he wore for show. It was a memory, a promise, a reminder of the weight he carried, and the men who had never made it home to carry theirs. He shifted in his seat, the jacket heavy across his knees. Outside the tall windows, a plane rolled down the tarmac, its silver skin gleaming in the early morning light. He watched it taxi into the gate, the hiss of brakes and the low growl of engines a song he had known all his life. He thought of the men who had sat beside him once, the way their laughter had echoed in the quiet nights, the way their voices had dropped to a hush when the world grew too loud. He thought of the way they had stood shoulder to shoulder, their lives bound together by something deeper than duty. The voices of the terminal washed over him, flight numbers and destinations, the soft murmur of families and strangers. But he heard something else too, something that lived in the steady rhythm of his heart. The memory of the jungle, the heat and the sweat, the bright crack of rifles in the dark. The way the world had fallen away in those moments, leaving only the quiet breath of the men beside him. He let the memory settle around him like a cloak, a comfort in the bright, impersonal hum of the airport. He didn't need the attention of the crowd. He didn't need the polite words or the quick, awkward salutes. What mattered was that he was still here, still carrying the weight, still honoring the promise he had made. A child ran past, his laughter bright and high, his mother calling after him with a tired smile. The man watched them go, the soft curve of his mouth almost a smile. Life went on. It always had. The overhead speakers crackled, a new flight arriving. People began to gather at the gate, their voices a low murmur of anticipation. The man sat still, his back straight, his hands folded around the weight of the jacket in his lap. The metal caught the light, a quiet glint of blue and silver in the shadows. No one noticed, or maybe they saw but didn't understand. He didn't mind. The men he had known would have understood. That was enough. The crowd shifted, the line at the gate growing. A man in a tailored suit brushed past, his eyes flicking over the metal without a pause. A woman in a flight attendant's uniform hesitated, her gaze lingering for a moment, but she turned away quickly when their eyes met. The man shifted again, the jacket heavy in his hands. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the low hum of the terminal fill the quiet spaces inside him. He thought of the day they had pinned the medal to his chest, the quiet words spoken over the soft rustle of the flag. He had never worn it for himself. He wore it for them, the ones who hadn't come home, the ones whose names he still carried in the hush of his thoughts. When he opened his eyes again, the gate was crowded, the first passengers already boarding. He watched them move, young and old, tired and eager, each with their own small story to carry. He watched them and thought of the way the world turned, the way it always seemed to forget the quiet weight of the men who had held the line when it mattered most. He didn't mind. He had never needed the world to see him, but he had needed to see them, each man he had carried, each breath they had shared in the dark. The last of the passengers boarded, the gate emptying in a slow trickle. The man shifted in his seat, his breath steady, his eyes calm. He waited. He had always been good at waiting. And somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a plane's engine grew closer, a sound that spoke of steel and sky and the quiet promise that some men still carried in the hush of their hearts. The low growl of the engines drew closer, a steady heartbeat in the quiet hum of the terminal. Carter didn't move, his hands resting lightly on the folded jacket in his lap, the small glint of the Medal of Honor catching the last light of the morning sun. The crowd at Gate 47 had thinned, most of the passengers already tucked away in their seats or moving on to other gates, their journeys barely intersecting with his quiet watch. But the man didn't mind. He had always known that some things were meant to be seen only by those who understood. Beyond the tall windows, the new arrival pulled up to the jet bridge, the soft hiss of brakes and the gentle bump of tires on tarmac. The plane was large and silver, its fuselage bright in the morning light, the black letters of the airline's name stark against the gleam. A crew of ground workers moved quickly, their neon vests bright against the dull gray of the concrete. The jet bridge inched forward, its mechanical sigh lost beneath the quiet voices of the flight attendants as they prepared to open the door. The man sat straighter, his shoulders square beneath the weight of memory. He didn't know who was coming, didn't need to. What mattered was the hush of the moment, the quiet breath of air that spoke of homecoming and the small, sharp hope that someone else might see what he carried in his lap. The first passengers stepped off the plane, blinking in the bright light of the terminal. Families reuniting with smiles and hurried words, business travelers adjusting their ties and scanning their phones. Carter watched them with the calm of a man who had learned that some things couldn't be hurried. Then he saw him. The man was tall, his uniform pressed to perfect lines, the 4 silver stars on his collar gleaming in the morning sun. His hair was close-cropped and silver at the temples, his eyes calm and steady beneath the weight of the years. As he stepped into the terminal, the crowd seemed to part around him, the quiet weight of command moving with him like a shadow. He walked with a purpose, each step measured and deliberate. He didn't look around, didn't scan the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the row of seats by the window, on the old man who sat there with the weight of a lifetime folded in his lap. For a moment, the noise of the terminal seemed to fade. Carter watched the general approach, the soft rhythm of his boots on the polished floor a quiet drumbeat in the hush. When the general reached him, he stopped. The 2 men looked at each other, a long moment of silence passing between them. One man in a uniform that carried the weight of 4 stars, the other in a plain shirt and khakis, the small ribbon of sky blue on his lapel the only sign of the battles he had fought. "Master Sergeant Carter," the general said, his voice low and even. Carter looked up, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "General," he said softly. For a moment, Neither spoke. Then the general's eyes flicked to the folded jacket in Carter's lap, the small star that shone in the early light. His jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath the clean line of his cheek. "You shouldn't be sitting here alone," the general said, his voice quiet but sure. "Not with what you've earned." Carter's smile was small and wry. "I've had plenty of quiet," he said. "I don't mind it." The general shook his head, his eyes steady. "It's not right," he said. "Not for you. Not for the men who stood with you." A young flight attendant paused a few seats away, her eyes catching on the two men, the small star on Carter's lapel. She hesitated, her mouth open as if to speak, then moved on quickly, her face pale. The general watched her go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Carter, his gaze softening. "Do you mind if I sit with you?" he asked. Carter shifted, the weight of the jacket in his lap a familiar comfort. "You're always welcome, sir," he said. The general lowered himself into the seat beside Carter, his posture straight, his boots planted solidly on the floor. For a moment, they sat in silence, the low hum of the terminal moving around them like a slow river. The general reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a small box, the dark leather worn smooth by years of careful handling. He held it in his hand, the light catching on the gold edges. "I've carried this with me for a long time," he said, his voice quiet. "A reminder of the men who came before me, of the promises we make and the ones we keep." He opened the box and Carter saw the ribbon inside. Another Medal of Honor, its star catching the light like the one that lay across his lap. The general didn't say anything more, just let the medal rest there in the hush of the terminal. Carter looked at it, his breath slow. "They never really leave us," he said softly. "The men we carried, the promises we made." The general nodded. "No," he said, "they don't." For a long moment, they sat like that. Two men with the weight of years in their hands, the quiet promise of respect passing between them without a word. Then the general closed the box and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Carter, his eyes steady. "You're not alone, Master Sergeant," he said. "Not while I still wear this uniform. Not while men like us remember what it cost." Carter's lips twitched in the faintest smile. "I know," he said, "and that's enough." They sat together in the hush of the gate, the world moving on around them. And in that quiet, they carried the weight of a promise that had never been forgotten. The hush between them felt like a pause in a long conversation, unspoken but full. Around them, the terminal moved on, voices calling out gate changes, families reuniting in bright hugs, the low murmur of wheels on tile. But at gate 47, the world felt smaller, quieter, as if it recognized that this moment was more than just two men talking. Carter shifted the jacket in his lap, his fingers brushing the small ribbon of blue. The general's presence was a calm weight beside him, a silent promise that didn't need words. It was the kind of quiet he had always trusted more than noise. The general glanced at the line forming at the nearby gate, then back at Carter. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked softly. Carter's mouth curved in a wry smile. "Most of the morning," he said. "But I don't mind the wait. It's peaceful in a way." The general nodded, his eyes steady. "Peace has always been earned," he said. For a moment, Carter said nothing. Then he let out a slow breath. "It's the small things," he said. "The way the world keeps moving, even when you're not sure you want to move with it." The general's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. "It's good you still can," he said. Carter's gaze turned back to the window, where another plane was pulling away from the gate, its engines bright against the sky. "Some days are easier than others," he said. "But it helps to know there are men who still remember. Men like you." The general's mouth tightened. "We owe you more than memory," he said. "Men like you made the rest of this possible." Carter's voice was soft. "We all carried something," he said. "Some of us just carried it a little longer." The general looked at him, his eyes shadowed with something like pride. "And some men carried it for all of us," he said. "That's why I'm here." A young man in a crisp uniform walked by, his eyes flicking to the medal in Carter's lap. He slowed, his mouth opening as if to speak, then hesitated. The general caught his eye and gave a small nod, a silent command that the young man seemed to feel in his bones. The young man straightened, his shoulders squaring, and moved on down the terminal, his head a little higher. Carter watched him go, a small smile on his lips. "They're good kids," he said softly. "They'll learn." The general nodded. "They will," he said, "because men like you showed them how." For a while, they let the hush settle around them. The world moved in small circles, planes coming and going, families gathering and parting. But at Gate 47, the quiet was different. It was a place apart, held still by the weight of the stories the two men shared. The general leaned back in his seat, his eyes thoughtful. "When I was a young lieutenant," he said, "there was an old sergeant who taught me something I never forgot. He said respect isn't a thing you're given because of rank. It's a thing you're given because of what you're willing to carry." Carter nodded slowly. "He was right," he said. "Rank can open doors, but it doesn't mean a thing if you're not willing to stand up when it matters." The general's gaze softened. "That's why men like you matter," he said. "Because you stood up. And because you kept standing, even when no one was watching." Carter's fingers tightened slightly around the jacket in his lap. "I'm not sure I'd know how to do anything else," he said quietly. The general let out a slow breath. "That's what makes you the man you are," he said. They fell silent again, the low murmur of the terminal a soft backdrop to the hush between them. Carter watched the planes lift into the sky, the slow, patient arc of flight that carried them out of sight. The general watched him, the quiet weight of command in his calm eyes. After a time, Carter shifted, his voice thoughtful. "You know, most days, it's enough just to see that ribbon," he said. "It reminds me who I was, who I still am in some small way." The general nodded. "And on the days it's not enough?" he asked. Carter's lips curved in a faint smile. "That's when men like you show up," he said, "to remind me that I'm not alone." The general's mouth tightened, his voice low. "You never were," he said. A boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, the cheerful voice almost jarring in the hush. The general stood, his posture straight and sure. "Come with me," he said. "You shouldn't be sitting here alone." Carter hesitated, then rose slowly, the weight of years in his knees but his back straight. "Where to, sir?" he asked, a trace of humor in his voice. The general's lips curved. "Where you belong," he said simply. They walked together down the terminal, the crowd parting around them. Some people watched, curiosity flickering in their eyes, but no one spoke. No one needed to. The sight of the Medal of Honor and the 4 stars on the general's collar spoke a language that didn't need words. They reached a quiet corner of the terminal, a row of empty chairs bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. The general gestured for Carter to sit, and for a moment the old soldier hesitated, then did as he was told. The general took the seat beside him, his eyes calm. "You're not here alone anymore," he said. And in that quiet, with the light of the evening on their faces and the hush of the world around them, Carter believed him. The chairs in the quiet corner were nothing special, plastic and metal, the same as 100 others in the airport. But in that hush, with the general beside him and the sun turning the glass to gold, Carter felt something different. As if the chair beneath him had been carved from oak and marble. As if the quiet was a cathedral built of small kindnesses and the slow patience of men who understood. The general sat back, his posture easy but alert. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. The 4 stars on his collar shone in the warm light, a quiet testament to years of command. But his eyes were soft as he looked at Carter, as if he knew that even 4 stars could be humbled by the weight of a single blue ribbon. They watched the planes come and go, the hush of takeoffs and landings a gentle music around them. Carter let his breath settle, the rhythm of it slow and steady. He thought of the men he'd known, men who had laughed in the face of fear, who had held the line when the world burned around them. Men who had carried him through the dark and trusted him to carry them home. He shifted the jacket in his lap, the Medal of Honor catching the light with each small motion. The general watched, his eyes lingering on the star that shone so bright it almost hurt to look at. "Do you ever put it away?" the general asked quietly. Carter's mouth curved in a wry smile. "I tried once," he said, "but it didn't feel right, like I was putting them away too. And they're still with me." The general nodded, his lips pressed tight. "I understand," he said, "more than you know." For a moment, they let the hush settle around them. The world moved on, voices calling out flight numbers, the bright clang of suitcases on tile. But in that small corner it felt like time had slowed, like the weight of all they had carried was the only thing that mattered. A young woman walked past, her eyes catching on the glint of the metal. She hesitated, her steps faltering. Then she lowered her head and kept walking, her face flushed. Carter watched her go, the faintest of smiles in his eyes. "Some see it and don't know what it means," he said softly. "Others see it and don't know what to say." The general's gaze was steady. "And some see it," he said, "and remember everything they ever promised to be." Carter let the words sink in. "That's enough," he said. "For me, that's always been enough." The general shifted, his hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair. "I'm going to make sure they see it," he said. "Not because of what it is, but because of who you are." Carter's breath caught, a small hitch that he quickly swallowed. "You've already done more than enough," he said. The general's mouth curved in a small, hard smile. "There's no such thing," he said. "Not when it comes to men like you." A hush fell over them, the weight of the day pressing close. Outside, the sky was a blaze of color, orange and gold, the first stars winking awake in the deepening blue. Carter watched it, the old ache in his chest easing in the warmth of the light. "I've spent most of my life in the back," he said softly. "Didn't mind it. Never needed the front row, the fancy seats. I just needed to know I was doing right by the men beside me." The general nodded. "You did," he said. "You still are." Carter let out a quiet breath, the slow smile returning to his lips. "That's all that matters," he said. They sat in silence as the terminal moved around them. Families hurrying to flights, pilots in crisp uniforms, the low murmur of lives in motion. But no one disturbed the quiet at Gate 47. No one dared. It was as if the weight of the Medal of Honor, and the man who wore it, had carved out a small patch of respect in a world too busy to see. The general shifted, his voice low. "When I was a captain, I had an old sergeant who told me that men like you don't need to speak loud to be heard," he said. "That the quiet ones are the ones who hold the line when the shouting's done." Carter's eyes crinkled in a faint smile. "He was a wise man," he said. The general nodded. "He was," he said, "and he'd have seen you for what you are, a man who never stopped standing." For a long moment, they let the words hang there, the soft hush of the terminal wrapping around them like a benediction. The general's presence was a quiet anchor, a promise that Carter wasn't alone, that the years hadn't dulled the weight of what he carried. At last, the general stood, his boots silent on the tile. He looked down at Carter, his eyes steady. "I'm due to board," he said, "but I wanted to make sure you knew. You're not invisible, Master Sergeant. Not while I'm here." Carter looked up, his own eyes bright in the fading light. "Thank you, sir," he said softly, "for seeing me." The general nodded once, his posture straight and sure. "Always," he said. Then he turned and walked away, his silhouette tall and strong in the glow of the evening sun. Carter watched him go, the hush of the moment lingering in the warm air. When the general disappeared into the crowd, Carter let out a long breath and leaned back in his seat. The weight of the Medal of Honor rested heavy in his lap, but it felt a little lighter now, shared in some quiet way by a man who understood. He let the last light of the sun warm his face, the hush of the terminal a soft echo in his ears. And in that quiet, Carter found a peace he had thought long lost. A simple promise that respect wasn't something you asked for, or something you took. It was something you carried mile after mile in the way you stood and the way you saw. Night had fallen by the time Carter rose from the chair. The terminal was quieter now, the bright glare of the day replaced by the softer glow of overhead lights. He moved with deliberate care, his steps steady but unhurried. In his chest, the hush of the general's words still echoed, a calm warmth that eased the weight of the hours. He walked the long concourse slowly, the jacket folded over his arm, the small glint of the Medal of Honor catching the dim light. A few passengers glanced at him as he passed, their eyes flicking to the ribbon before slipping away. He didn't mind. He had never worn it for them. He had worn it for the men who had stood beside him, and the promise he had carried long after they were gone. At a quiet corner of the terminal, Carter paused. There was a small coffee kiosk there, the bright green sign flickering slightly in the low light. He stepped up to the counter, the young man behind it glancing up with polite indifference. "Coffee, please," Carter said softly. "Black." The young man nodded and turned to fill the order, the hiss of the machine and the rich scent of roasting beans filling the air. Carter waited, his hands resting lightly on the counter. The weight of the years settled in the slow bend of his shoulders. When the cup was ready, the young man set it down without a word, his eyes catching on the small ribbon in Carter's hand. For a moment, he hesitated, his mouth opening as if to speak. But then he looked away, his face flushing. Carter didn't mind. Some things were easier left unsaid. He took the coffee and moved to a small table by the window, the chair cool beneath him as he settled in. The terminal outside was a blur of motion and color. Flashing signs, shifting shadows, the low murmur of voices that never really fell silent. But here, in this small pool of light, Carter felt a quiet peace. He sipped the coffee slowly, the bitter warmth a comfort against the chill of the air conditioning. Each swallow was a small anchor, a reminder that the world might keep moving, but some things were worth holding still for. He let his thoughts wander as he sat there, the slow drift of memory as familiar as the hum of the engines outside. He thought of the men he had known, the ones who had laughed in the dark and stood when the world demanded it. He thought of the way they had carried each other, mile after mile, through mud and fire and nights that seemed to stretch forever. He thought of the general, of the calm in his voice, the surety in his step, the quiet promise in his eyes. A man who had seen the ribbon and understood not just what it was, but what it meant. A man who had stood not because he had to, but because he believed. A woman passed by, her eyes tired, a child sleeping on her shoulder. She glanced at Carter as she went, her gaze lingering for a moment on the small blue ribbon before she moved on. Carter watched her go, the faintest of smiles in his eyes. The world would always keep moving, but sometimes, in the quiet spaces between flights and footsteps, there was a moment of recognition. A small, silent nod that said, "I see you." He finished the coffee and stood, his legs stiff but steady. He walked back through the terminal, the late-night hush wrapping around him like a familiar coat. The lights were dimmer now, the bright edges of the day softened into the gentle glow of evening. As he neared the exit, a young security guard stood by the door, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He straightened as Carter approached, his gaze dropping to the metal for just a moment before rising again to meet Carter's eyes. "Have a good night, sir," he said quietly. Carter paused, the weight of the jacket in his hands, and nodded. "You too, son," he said, his voice low. He stepped out into the night air, the soft warmth of it a relief after the chill of the terminal. The parking lot stretched out before him, pools of yellow light and long shadows. The old pickup waited at the edge of the lot, the paint dull but familiar, the kind of friend that didn't need words to share the road. Carter took his time crossing the lot, each step a quiet echo of the miles he had already walked. He didn't hurry. He had learned long ago that some things deserved the slow measure of a man's breath, the careful weight of a step that said, "I'm still here." When he reached the truck, he paused with his hand on the door, the worn metal cool beneath his palm. He looked back at the terminal, the soft glow of it against the night sky, and let the hush of the moment settle deep in his chest. He thought of the general's words, "You're not alone," and he believed them. He climbed into the truck and started the engine, the low rumble a comfort in the quiet. The headlights cut a soft path through the darkness, the road opening up before him in long, patient lines. As he drove, he let the memory of the day wash over him. The faces, the words, the small, quiet kindness of a man who had seen him and chosen to stand beside him. The weight of the metal in his pocket was the same as it had always been, but it felt different now, lighter somehow. Shared. He drove slow, the night rolling out ahead of him, the low hum of the engine a steady song in the hush. And in that quiet, with the stars bright in the sky and the road stretched out like a promise, Carter knew that respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you carried, something you earned, and something that, once given, could never truly be taken away. The night was deep and still, the road unfolding ahead in quiet lines of silver light. Carter drove with the window down, the warm breath of summer air washing over him, the sweet scent of honeysuckle and old fields filling the cab. The battered Ford moved slow, its engine a low hum that matched the steady beat of his heart. Each mile felt like a prayer, a slow, patient reminder that he was still here, still moving, still carrying the weight of the men who had stood with him in the dark. The old truck rattled on the rough pavement, the tires singing a song of dust and memory. He let it lull him, the rhythm of the road a comfort against the long hush of the years. At a quiet crossroads, he pulled over and turned off the engine, the sudden hush settling around him like a blanket. He leaned back in the seat, his eyes on the stars that burned bright above the dark line of the trees. The metal rested in his pocket, a small weight that had carried him through more nights than he could count. For a long moment he sat in the hush, the soft breath of the wind in the leaves, the gentle chirp of crickets in the grass. He thought of the men he had known, the way they had laughed and cursed and prayed in the same breath, the way they had watched each other's backs without ever needing to say why. He thought of the general, of the calm in his voice, the surety in his step, the quiet promise in his eyes. "You're not alone." The words echoed in the hush, a soft counterpoint to the weight of the years. Carter closed his eyes and let the memory of that moment wash over him. The way the general had stood beside him without question. The way he had spoken his name like it mattered. Like he mattered. He let out a slow breath and started the engine again, the rumble of it steady and sure. The road unspooled ahead of him, long and open in the soft darkness. He drove slow, each mile a quiet testament to the promise that respect was not something you claimed. It was something you gave, something you shared. When he reached home, the small white house was dark and quiet, the porch light out, the garden sleeping in the cool of the night. He parked the truck and climbed the steps, the old boards creaking beneath his boots. He paused at the door, his hand on the worn wood, the hush of the night wrapping around him like a memory. Inside, the house was cool and still, the faint scent of coffee and dust hanging in the air. Carter set the jacket on the back of the chair by the window, the small star of the Medal of Honor catching the light of the moon. He touched it once, a gentle brush of his fingers against the ribbon, and let out a quiet breath. He moved through the house with the slow, measured steps of a man who had learned that each step was a promise. He paused by the old bookshelf, his eyes lingering on the framed photograph of the men he had known, young faces, bright with laughter and the quiet weight of the world. He let his hand rest on the frame, his fingers tracing the edge of the glass. "You're not alone." The words echoed in the quiet, a soft benediction that eased the old ache in his chest. He settled into the chair by the window, the moonlight soft on his face, the hush of the house a gentle breath around him. The medal lay in his lap, the small weight of it a quiet promise that some things never faded, that some things were carried in the slow, patient beat of a man's heart. He thought of the general, of the way he had seen Carter, really seen him in a world that was always too busy to look. He thought of the way the man had spoken his name like it mattered, the way he had stood beside him without question or hesitation. He let the memory settle around him, the hush of the night deep and soft. Outside, the world turned in slow circles, the stars bright against the velvet dark. He closed his eyes and let the quiet fill the small, warm spaces behind his ribs. In that hush, he felt the presence of the men he had known, the men he had carried and who had carried him in turn. He felt the weight of their laughter, the soft murmur of their voices in the dark. He felt the promise of the general's words, a promise that said, "You're not alone, not ever again." He let out a long breath and leaned back in the chair, the slow smile on his lips as gentle as the hush of the night. The medal rested warm in his hands, a small weight that had always been more than metal and ribbon. It was a promise, a bond, a quiet testament to the way men saw each other in the dark and chose to stand. And in that hush, in the soft breath of the night, Carter knew that he was not alone, that he had never really been alone. 3 weeks later, a plain brown envelope appeared on Carter's porch. No return address, no markings, only a handwritten line. For Sergeant First Class William Carter. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single letter on official Pentagon stationery, and tucked behind it a photo. The letter began, "Sergeant Carter, I write not only on behalf of the United States Army, but on behalf of everyone who's ever worn the uniform. That day on the plane when you were left in silence, forced to sit in economy while your medal was ignored, I didn't speak up fast enough. Not until I saw the symbol on your chest, the Medal of Honor." At the bottom, it was signed, handwritten, not printed, by a 4-star general. The next paragraph struck him harder than the rest. "I've seen too many heroes forgotten, too many sacrifices dismissed. But not that day. That day we remembered. And I want you to know, silence does not mean invisibility. Some symbols speak louder than any rank or word." Carter swallowed hard and turned the photograph over. It showed the moment the entire cabin stood still, the general at the front of the plane, saluting sharply, not to another general, not to the captain, but to Carter. The man in the aisle seat. The passenger with the quiet eyes and the faded green jacket. You could see it in the photo. Every passenger standing, flight attendants wiping tears, even the pilot stepping from the cockpit with his hand raised in salute. The Medal of Honor glinting faintly on Carter's chest under the soft cabin light. On the back of the photo, someone had written in blue pen, "He walked quietly, but the whole plane stood still." Carter folded the letter with care and placed it gently into an old wooden box. The same one where he kept his medals, not for display, but for remembrance. Then he sat down, not in silence, but in peace, and exhaled. The following morning, he drove himself to a local elementary school. No TV cameras, no ribbon, just one man with a story to tell. He spoke softly to a class of 5th graders, not about battles or medals, but about a friend who once saved his life. He didn't mention names or dates, just courage. A little girl raised her hand and asked, "Were you scared?" Carter smiled. "Yes, but courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It just means you keep going anyway." When he finished, the children clapped. Not because they knew what he'd done, but because they could feel who he was. Before he left, he signed the guest book. "Your courage may never wear a uniform, but it will always matter." A few days later, a local news segment aired, "Medal of Honor recipient visits 5th grade class." The clip showed Carter kneeling among the children, teaching them how to fold a flag properly. But in the online comments, it wasn't that video that went viral. It was the photograph, the one from the plane, the moment of the salute, the quote scribbled on the back. And soon something shifted. At airports, in grocery lines, at gas stations, people began to recognize the quiet veteran. Some simply nodded. Others placed a hand over their heart. But none of them ignored him. One early morning, Carter passed through TSA. The young officer didn't notice the medal, but the older one beside him leaned over and whispered something. The young agent's eyes widened. He dropped his clipboard, stood up straight, and saluted. "Sir." Carter didn't salute back. He never did. He simply smiled and said, "You're doing fine, son." Weeks later, another small box arrived. Inside was a custom-made coin, about the size of a dog tag, engraved with 2 lines, "Not ignored, never alone." Carter pinned it quietly into the inner lining of his old baseball cap. Not where anyone could see, just where he could feel it. Because some honors aren't worn for attention. They're carried for memory, for legacy, for the kind of quiet dignity that once made a plane full of strangers rise to their feet, simply because one man kept walking, If the story moved you, please share it. Because some symbols speak louder than words. And some men don't need to shout to make the world stand still.